please? Where's the boat train?
This one's Nightingale died.
What is the height of the Empire State?
You, Richard Hannay?
Listen, there's something you ought to know.
Please, Hannay, come along quietly.
Yes, but look here, that man on the stage...
Now, look here, old man, you don't want to cause any trouble and spoil people's entertainment.
Not cause any trouble? Good grief, officer. Hannay has legged it from London to Scotland, swung from the Forth Bridge, been chased around the Highlands, handcuffed to Madeleine Carroll. OK, worse things happen. And is now, back at the London Palladium, cracked the mystery of Mr. Memory. And what do we get from the force? British suburban twee, woolly cardigan put-downs. It's the guff which drives fellows to head for the borders, lead jihads, impale Tsarina's murderers on bayonets, vacation in Biarritz, chase A-bombs in pre-war Albania, fail to assassinate Hitler, book onto the Orient Express, play poker and golf with psychos from Smersh. Spoiling people's entertainment? Get to it, Hannay.
What are the 39 steps? Come on, answer up! What are the 39 steps?
The 39 Steps is an organisation of spies, collecting information on behalf of the Foreign Office of...
Mr. Memory's recollection had, for once, failed him. Alfred Hitchcock's classic 1935 film climaxed at the Palladium. It pinpointed the 39 steps in cinematic history. It made Robert Donat's Hannay the archetype of the celluloid British action hero. People just can't leave the 39 steps alone. In childhood, the title, sinister, mysterious, intrigued me long before I read the book. Or, it was the 1950s, saw the hopeless Kenneth More film version. The 1987 movie was even worse. They just cannot film John Buchan's 1915 story, just as, half a century later, they could not film Ian Fleming's first James Bond, Casino Royale. The 39 Steps effectively launched the tradition of the 20th century British spy thriller.
I was alone, in a landscape as peaceful as any in the world. Yet for the first time, I felt the terror of the hunted. I knew that plane was looking for me. I also knew it did not belong to the police. I began to think less well of the countryside I had chosen to hide in. These heather hills were no good if my enemy was in the sky. What I needed was a house.
To this day, I cannot see or hear a single-engine monoplane droning over Camden Town or Cheltenham, home counties or Scotland, but I have my mind slipping back to Hannay's borders and that sinister flying machine. The book climaxed not at the London Palladium, but where I am now, at Broadstairs in Kent, or Bradgate as Buchan called it. Buchan was not the first or last thriller writer to locate threats in the nation on the seemingly mild south coast. As for the 39 Steps, well, they were not Mr. Memory's organisation of spies, but 39 Steps, leading down from the curious Mr. Appleton's Trafalgar Lodge to the sea. Or should we talk about Der Schwarzer Stein, the Black Stone Gang?
What is going on is much bigger than governments. There are capitalists, anarchists, and financiers out there plotting to make millions by setting the civilized nations at each other's throats. Karolithis is one of the few who can stop them. And that's why they've marked him down.
How do you know all this?
Give me another drink and I'll tell you.
I'll join you. Thank you. Carry on, Mr.
Scudder. Franklin P. Scudder. I spent the last year on their trail. I got the first hint in an inn on the Achensee in Tyrol. I collected another clue in a fur shop in the Galician quarter of Buda. Another from the Strangers Club in Vienna, and a fourth in a bookshop off the Rachnerstrasse in Leipzig. 10 days ago, I completed my evidence in Paris. They're going to murder Karolithis when he comes here on an official visit on June the 15th. 1 month from now.
Why wait till then?
In Greece, he's got bodyguards who'd kill their grandmothers if they laid a finger on him. But in London, where he's just one more foreign dignitary...
If you're so sure, why don't you warn him off coming?
What? And play their game? No. He's the only man who can sort things out. If he doesn't come, They've won.
Then tip off the British. Surely the police...
The whole of
could-
Scotland Yard couldn't save them from these people. They're not playing for beans, my friend. Listen, the killer will be an Austrian, which will make it look as if Vienna and Berlin are involved. Then Russia will go to war with Germany and all hell will break loose. Unless Franklin P. Scudder is there to stop it. As long as I can stay alive till June 15th.
Are they onto you?
I thought I'd pretty well muddied my trail until last night. There was someone I sort of recognized hanging about this block.
What kind of people are they who are out to get you?
Well, they're in with the highest, I can tell you that. People you wouldn't suspect in a million years. They call themselves the Black Stone.
The what?
The Black Stone, Mr. Hanny, and I can assure you it's no laughing matter.
In 1914, as the world sunk into the First World War, Buchan was convalescing in bed at St Ronan's, Stone Road, Broadstairs, and writing the 39 Steps. A pink and blue June morning found me at Bradgate looking from the Griffin Hotel over a smooth sea to the lightship on the Cock Sands, which seemed the size of a bellboy, wrote Buchan that August, 86 years ago. A couple of miles further south and much nearer the shore, a small destroyer was anchored. Well, there's no destroyer anchored nearby today. I suspect there are very few destroyers anchored anywhere in the neighbourhood these days. And there's no pink and blue June morning either. In fact, it's just started raining. What we have is grey-green light, classic southern English coast day, I guess. Out on the horizon somewhere I can just see a vast tanker, the kind of tanker which would have belonged to the realm of science fiction all those years ago. It's a fire rescue boat. But along the White Cliffs, I'm pleased to see, there is a mansion. Or at any rate, with my imagination and this distance, it should be a mansion. The stuff of the Black Stone, just above the White Cliffs. And as for steps to the sea, well, there are some, provided, I fear, by the local authority rather than by the strange forces of 1914. Well, no Whippet light destroyers, green waters, and that sense of the frontier again. The frontier which I think we'll be looking at more in the course of this programme. The plot logic of the 39 Steps leaves something to be desired, as does characterisation. No matter. Pretty well everybody who's subsequently put pen to paper and attempted a thriller, Sapper, Eric Ambler, Geoffrey Household, Ian Fleming, Len Dayton, John le Carré, Frederick Forsyth, ended up or started out being compared with Buchan in general and the 39 Steps in particular.
They all went to Broadstairs because my sister had been ill too, and so they went for some sea air.
William Buchan.
And lying in bed, he wrote the 39 Steps. Because he'd always been rather irritated by thrillers, by spy books, and detective stories, in that they weren't either really literate or sufficiently well put together. Anyway, he had a shot. And he sent it to the publisher saying, I don't know what you'll think of this, but I've enjoyed writing it. Where's that effect? And it was, of course, a worldwide bestseller.
Whodunits ask who, why and how. Thrillers, as Julian Simmons observed, are about how. There were plenty of attempts before Buchan came along. In his 39 Steps dedication to Tommy Nelson of the Lothian and Border Horse, who died at the Battle of Arras in 1917, Buchan spoke of his affection for that elementary type of tale which Americans call the dime novel, and which we know as the shocker. What had sparked elementary tales, focusing on spies, conspiracy and dread foreign plots, was the Prussian victory over France in 1870. Europe's greatest army had been defeated. A united Germany dominated the continent, having vanquished the French. Good God! Could they do it to us? The greatest empire in the world? According to Colonel Sir George Tompkins Chesney of the Royal Engineers, they could. In 1871, Blackwood's magazine serialised Chesney's The Battle of Dorking. It dealt with the Prussian invasion of England. Most of the Royal Navy is otherwise engaged. 10,000 soldiers have gone off to defend Canada. The Prussians deploy secret weapons against the fleet, and its regulars rout the gallant but hopelessly outclassed British volunteers. 70 years before the Battle of Britain, the book was a sensation, translated and copied throughout Europe. In the American version, The Stricken Nation, it was the British who were the invaders. There were British spies in our arsenals, and lavish outlays of gold lured pork-barrelling US congressmen to ignore defence. Jokes followed, on seeing an injured friend. "I say, old man, where did you get that broken arm?" "That? Oh, nothing really. Battle of Dorking." Dorking crystallised fear. The unification of Germany and France's defeat had turned the continent upside down. New technology, telegraphy, steam, ironclads, Maxim guns, were turning the world upside down. There were plans of secret weapons worth stealing, so there had to be organised groups of men and women in the shadows cast by industry and imperial power doing the stealing. Society, the established order, was under threat and caught on a helter-skelter of innovation and upheaval. The Tsar was assassinated in 1884. Nihilists were blamed. 1894. President Carnot of France was assassinated. Anarchists were blamed. 1901. President McKinley of the United States was assassinated. Anarchists again. It was terrifying. It was the stuff of nightmares. And it was great pulp fiction. Dorking aside, until the end of the 19th century, France was identified as the main fictional threat to Britain's soul and well-being, doubling up in 1894 with Russia for the snappily titled Great War in England in 1897. But, new century, new enemy. By then, William Le Coeur and E. Phillips Oppenheim had begun fiction production lines. These accounted between them for about a dozen titles a year for years and years. They covered romantic fiction and high finance, mysteries, gangster stories, and spy stories. Le Coeur was the first British writer to write consistently about espionage, and Oppenheim was described, quite inexplicably to me, by Bucham as the best Jewish writer since Isaiah. In 1907, Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent was published. It was great literature. So was his Under Western Eyes, 4 years later, and both dealt with a squalid reality. Le Coeur's The Invasion of 1910, meanwhile, sold 1 million. It was serialised by the Daily Mail in 1906. The Mail's proprietor, the later Lord Northcliffe, wisely insisted that the Germans' progress from the Channel should take in, irrespective of Schlieffen plans, etc., every town where the Mail needed to boost its circulation. The book was translated into 27 languages, and a century down the line, like the works of Oppenheim, is unreadable. Not so Erskine Childers' The Riddle of the Sands, a record of Secret Service, published in 1903. Its title, like the 39 Steps, is an immediate come-on. Its story is of the discovery of the Kaiser's invasion fleet, out there, beyond the southwestern horizon, past the Zuyder Zee in Friesland. The protagonists are the yachtsmen Carruthers and Davis, and the yarn gripped Bucham, provided a fantasy character for Eric Ambler's The Dark Frontier 3 decades later, and still pulls today. Carruthers and Davis, amateur defenders of empire, cheerleaders for an Anglo-German arms race.
Have you ever heard of the 39 Steps?
No, what's that, a pub?
Never mind. But what you were laughing at just now is true. These men will stick at nothing. You don't know how clever their chief is.
Who is he? What's his name?
He has a dozen names, and he can look like 100 people. But one thing he cannot disguise. This.
Throughout his life, optimism was the key.
William Bucham.
He detested the idea that the human race was declining. He detested the idea, as he says in one of his books, I think it's Augustus, that humanity is nothing but a lot of guzzling, lecherous little animals. He liked to believe that we were all better than that. The Calvinist upbringing had marked him in a very good way. It had not made him bigoted or savage. It had given him a very rich and solid background of Christianity. And when I tell you that Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress was probably bar none his favourite work, and the references to it can be found all throughout his own writings, I believe that as a Christian and a pilgrim is how he would probably prefer to be remembered.
One evening in a London pub, I ran into a Scots friend. He was, he told me, rechristening his country folk rock group. A wonderful band. They did everything from Hank Williams and Johnny Cash to Cajun and Chuck Berry, with this swirling, hypnotic fiddle. Names? Well, there'd been a bit of a problem. There had been Alive and Picking, High Speed Grass, but no. Well, they were to be the Companions of the Rosy Hours. Good God, I said. Bucham, Greenmantle. You were one of two, he said. No one else got it. Fancy a drink? Bucham wrote parts of Greenmantle while convalescing from a duodenal attack, this time in an emergency hospital in France, with the distant sound of gunfire and manuscript pages cascading down the sheets. It followed Hannah as he struggled across war-torn Europe in search of a mysterious Islamic leader who threatened to rain a jihad down on the Western Allies. Sounds familiar? There was a lot of weird stuff in that 1916 book, the second of the wartime Hannah trilogy, Drugs.
Presently a light step fell on the stairs, and Hussein drew back to let someone enter. Sandy stood there, but a new Sandy who made Blenkiron and me jump to our feet. The pelts and skin cap had gone, and he wore instead a long linen tunic clasped at the waist by a broad girdle. Strange green turban adorned his head. The lantern showed his haggard eyes with dark lines beneath them. "Good God, old man, have you been sick?" I cried. "Not sick," he said hoarsely. "My body is right enough, but the last few days I've been living in hell." "Great heavens, man, you've been drugged," I said.
Sexual beastliness.
"We're at the last lap now. One more spurt and it's over. You've got to tell me what the new snag is. Is it that woman?" He shivered like a frightened kilt. "Woman," he cried. "Does a woman drag a man through the nether pit? She is a she-devil. Oh, it isn't madness that's wrong with her. She's as sane as you and as cool as Blenkiron. Her life is an infernal game of chess, and she plays with souls for pawns. She is evil, pure evil."
Eric Ambler reckoned the relationship between Colonel Stumm, a man of remarkable qualities which would have brought him to the highest distinction in the Stone Age, as Hannah observed, and Hannah, culminated in an unconscious rape scene. Bucham was a staggeringly prolific writer, particularly since he combined that career with a public life which culminated in his Governor-Generalship of Canada. Hannah was not his only popular fiction hero, but it is the 39 Steps Hannah who still survives, less so perhaps Greenmantle Hannah. And yet, a recent book on the 1940s I saw featured a photograph of a fighter pilot waiting to scramble, poised in his cockpit. He was reading Greenmantle. Some of the rhythm and plotting of Greenmantle, which climaxes with the last victory of the Imperial Russian army over the Turks at the Battle of Erzurum, reverberates in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, just as Tolkien reverberates in Star Wars. Once you've lived one empire, you've lived them all.
Are shining in Picardy.
In the British Library, the oldest extant edition of the 39 Steps and other stories, like The King of Ypres, is not 1915, its first publication, but from 1917, and that edition is published by Nelson's Continental Library, 189 Rue Saint-Jacques, Paris. Quote, "Not to be taken into Great Britain, the colonies, or the United States," unquote. Just £2, with a green mottled cover, It is the edition that Tommies on leave would have bought. The back pages list other authors, Rider Haggard, Baroness Orczy, Jack London, Conan Doyle, who comprised the stuff of Great War popular fiction. It was curious, poignant, staring at the book under library neon. No glossy postmodern penguin, this. Its tawdry cheapness evoked a world of conscripts dreaming of escape from that horror. Out of the Flanders front and back to the pre-war Scottish border sun, just before the world collapsed.
But there's one rose that dies not in Picardy. 'Tis the rose I keep in my heart.
His morning routine, if it were a London day, would be to rise, I think, at 8 o'clock.
William Bucham.
And he would then step down very briskly, and if it was a summer morning, he'd go, before breakfast, out into the garden to look for a buttonhole. And I see him very clearly, stepping briskly, because he never walked slowly, looking perhaps at some rosebuds on the small rose trees which grow outside the side door in the garden, or going down to the long herbaceous border to pick perhaps a cornflower or pink. He would then rapidly have his breakfast, rush upstairs and say goodbye to my mother, who invariably breakfasted in bed, almost invariably. And by that time, Amos Webb would have brought the car around to the door, and he would jump in the car and go off.
Yes, the times are different, and for people of Buchan's decent Tory background and outlook, anti-Semitism was part of the landscape, which maybe explains, but excuses nothing. Yet there isn't viciousness, calculated or otherwise, in his writing.
Really, Drummond is a man with a tremendously strong code of conduct. I mean, he would never do anything against this code. And that was, I think, quite true of everybody of his type of the time, immediately after the First World War, in the early 20s, and in fact right on through into the early 30s. To give you a ridiculous case, but I mean, he would never wear brown shoes with a blue suit. The code was something that mattered to him frightfully. But there is another difficulty to this, and that is that Drummond has never grown up. He's remained at about the same age. And one had to keep him there, because otherwise he would not have had the physical attributes to do the things that he, in fact, does do in these stories. And all his friends, of course, have remained approximately the same age, too. But this code business, you see, he's never changed, and neither have his pals. In any of the stories, I've kept that just as it was. And somehow or other, it hasn't displeased people, because they continue to be interested in these stories.
That was Gerald Fairley on Sapper, Mac to his friends, otherwise Lieutenant Colonel Herman Cyril McNeill. Fairley, apart from taking over Sapper's Bulldog Drummond series when Sapper died in 1937, was said to be an inspiration for the character of Captain Hugh Drummond, DSO MC, late of The Great Game, The Great War, and his Royal Loamshires. A sportsman, a gentleman. There were many ex-soldiers, wrote Sapper in the first of his thrillers, Bulldog Drummond, in 1920, who acknowledge only two rulers, the King and Hugh Drummond, and they would willingly die for either. Drummond spent the first 4 volumes squaring up to Carl Peterson and his, muse, amour, partner, Irma. Quote, with a gentle laugh, Irma offered him a cigarette. Mon Dieu, she remarked, but you are the most gloriously ugly, my Hugh. Unquote. Bulldog, I'm happy to report, looked at her coldly. Irma survived, but Carl's passing, facilitated by Bulldog, knocked a lot of the stuffing out of the series. In his own way, he did live on, though. The life of the likes of Drummond was straightforward. They live in rooms in London West 1, explained Richard Usborne in his splendid book Clubland Heroes. Each has a man to look after him. He eats a large breakfast. He then strolls to his club for a beer at midday, a few martinis before lunch. Then Lord's or the Oval, or a game of golf at Roehampton. Dinner out or at the club again. An evening's yarning or playing poker. Perhaps a kipper at a nightclub with a topping filly. Then home and a bachelor's bed in the rooms. All of which, together with Bulldog's disgusting habit of lighting particularly noisy pipes and gnawing cutlets, is top hole, or at least middling to lower hole. Ronald Colman, among others, played Drummond on screen, even if he did not have the topping luck of getting Hitchcock to direct. But there are some problems with the gloriously ugly Hugh. Childer's plot unfolded. Buchan could get the old story moving along, even if Hannay did get in a surfeit of detours around moorland, scones, boiled eggs and nights in hay-strewn barns. But Sapper's plots have all the mobility and tactical awareness of the Battle of the Somme. Bad guy advances, good guy retreats, good guy advances. Time for some honest British fisticuffs, and then the whole wearisome business is repeated. Sapper was not alone with this problem.
Your name, please?
Bill Muir.
Occupation?
Inspector of Taxes.
Your chosen specialised subject?
The works of Dawnford Yeats.
Mr. Muir, you have 2 minutes on the works of Dawnford Yeats. Starting... Now, what was the name of the Harrow schoolmaster to whom Dawnford Yeats dedicated both Blind Corner and Wife Apparent?
Norman Kenneth Stephen.
Correct.
Yes, well, Yeats had, perhaps, still has, legions of devotees, and indeed Tom Sharp, no slouch, reckoned Blind Corner, which debuted Yeats' superhero Jonathan Mansell, as a rattling good yarn. Well, it's always good to quit Blighty and get out on the road in the splendid Rolls-Royce Tourer, speeding across the white dusty byways of 1920s Europe towards Biarritz or Carinthia. Yeats' first book in 1914 was a ghosted memoirs for Edward VII's chauffeur. The late monarch was big on Biarritz, but when Yeats's drives ended,
You may answer.
Where there's a will.
No, it was Lady Friends. And at the end of that round, Mr. Muir, you have scored 14 points.
As I was saying, when the drive ended, the Great War slog, hero has idea, villain has idea, recommences. Military strategy, or lack of it, was plot device. In Sapper, there is a more serious problem. If Buchan's anti-Semitism was part of the landscape of the times, Sapper's goes beyond it. If Karl Petersen, his favourite villain, has echoes of anyone, to me it was a demonisation of the great German Jewish politician Rathenau, whose murder by Nazis was an awful warning. Bolsheviks stewed against doors? This I can handle. But Jewish white slavers, flogged nearly to death and found in a slum near Whitechapel, I have difficulties with. It was the world of reaction to the Russian Revolution, cataclysmic war, queasy peace. The established order was no longer just under threat, the helter-skelter was out of control. Elsewhere they got the fascisti, the Freikorps, the Action Française, and Nazism. Here we got...
In the lives of great nations comes the moment of decision, comes the moment of destiny. And this nation again and again in the great hours of its fate has swept aside convention, has swept aside the little men of talk and of delay, and has decided to follow men and movements who say we go forward to action. Let who dare follow us in this hour. That is the permanent, the mighty mood of Britain. And I claim that in the ranks of our black shirt legions march the mighty ghosts of England's past, and their strong arms around us, and their voices echo down the ages, saying onward.
Thanks, Sir Oswald. And Sapper. With Ambler, everything changed.
Und der Haifisch, der hat Zähne und die trägt...
I started out as a kind of crypto-communist. I had Soviet agents who were heroes, but somebody has described it as standing with thriller on its head.
In the late 1920s, in Ashendon, Somerset Maugham had used his own Great War experience and written unsentimentally, realistically about espionage. But Maugham was a toff. In the mid-1930s, Ambler, observing the world crisis, did not immediately see that world from the point of view of the haves. Mr. Ambler had changed trains, or at least the class of his compartment.
Und sein Geld hat mächtige Messer, den man nichts beweisen kann.
1934. Ambler is in Marseille and fantasises that he is an assassin. A couple of weeks later, in the very spot that he had chosen, King Alexander of Yugoslavia and the French foreign minister were assassinated. I felt oddly guilty, he would write, but also pleased. In the Mediterranean sunshine there were strange and violent men with whom I could identify and with whom, in a way, I was in touch.
I'd like to begin, really, with your early childhood, Mr. Ambler. What was it like?
A nasty little boy, I would say. With very nice parents. Not very well off. I lived in southeast London, got a scholarship to a grammar school, and eventually, to the great surprise of everyone concerned, a scholarship to a university. But I would say a delinquent from an early age. With my friends, I used to break in to private property.
There is about Ambler a touch of Ken Livingstone, or John Major.
I believe your parents were in show business.
Yes, they were in Concert Party, an institution very, very popular then on the ends of piers and things, seaside resorts.
What were your first attempts at writing?
Lyrics, sketches, which were supposed to be extremely funny, but of course weren't, because they were largely derivative of other things. Then I tried writing a novel, naturally about a concert party, but J.B. Priestley did it rather better, so I abandoned that attempt.
By 1935, Ambler was working for his ad agency, living in a bedsit in Morton Place, Pimlico, and working on his first thriller. "Queer how dreams stayed with you," he wrote in The Dark Frontier. "One half of your brain became an inspired reasoning machine, while the other wandered over dark frontiers into strange countries, where adventure, romance, and sudden death lay in wait for the traveller." And frontiers in the mind, frontiers of geography, run through the novels that followed. Uncommon Danger, Epitaph for a Spy, Cause for Alarm, The Mask of Demetrios, a title that sparks like the 39 Steps, Journey into Fear.
Although people sometimes said that they were spy stories, they were, in fact, spies only come into the most very subordinate characters. I've never written a book in which a spy was a central character. So to that extent, they're really not spy stories. Intrigue is a word that the Americans use about books, and it seems to be to sum up the situation.
And of course they all have lovely foreign settings.
Yes, I have a taste for the exotic, and a complete inability, in my own opinion, to write a novel with an English setting.
Ambler could see in the little capitals of Europe the makings of the war between the great powers of the continent. In 1936 he also provided an Albania-like country with an admittedly curious A-bomb in The Dark Frontier.
I'd never been a communist, but I believed in the notions of the Popular Front, that it was possible for everyone to combine, all men of goodwill to combine together for a common good and change the world.
And in a world grinding out of control, Ambler conveyed a sense of helplessness, a man wondering what the hell was going on, ducking and diving, making out. So did Geoffrey Household.
Rogue Mail was about as near sheer inspiration as you can get, and pure imagination, and it did come from a thought I'd had for a very long time, to how far a man could escape police and enemies by living underground if he had the guts to do so. And I think the whole thing came out of that. That was the original idea of living underground in summer in England, and how long you could avoid public and police, practically forever, until the winter threw you out.
Good God. The great man himself. The beloved Führer. By himself. Walking slowly across the lawn towards me. Up and over into the bracken. Steady, tripod, aim, set the sight. 500 years. Safety catch down. The V of his waistcoat at 500. Come on. Come on. The V of his...
Stop! Stop! Don't move, or I will shoot.
You're 7 minutes early. 7 minutes early.
I turned back. I knew.
1939. Household's fictional assassin finds he is no longer alone.
I know that you had written a book which has become, of its type, a classic, Rogue Male. Story of a man, an unnamed man, who decides to rid the world of an unnamed dictator, and most people had an idea it might have been Hitler.
Yes, it was Hitler, but I didn't want to say so straight out, because it would only have made things worse.
A very exciting book, but by the time it was published, and having its great success, you were out of the country.
I was. I had left for Bucharest before war was declared.
Your war started?
On the military mission.
A secret mission, which I don't believe is secret any longer.
No.
Tell us about it. What was it for?
It was to deprive the Germans of the Romanian oil wells.
How?
Oh, blow them up, destroy them, as was done in the First War, very successfully.
Yes.
But we were working, of course, together with the French. And the fall of France just wrecked the whole plan in various ways. We couldn't do it.
You had made your plans, you'd got the explosives,
oh, yes.
You'd got everything necessary.
Oh, yes.
Where did you get the explosives from?
Oh, well, it came out, you know, from England in various ways.
I see, yes.
The old world vanishes. 6 years later, a new one emerges into chaos. A pre-war fictional Middle Europe, defined by Ambler, gives way on post-war screen, thanks to a Graham Greene script, to Orson Welles, Harry Lime, The Third Man, Demetrius in Vienna. But that level of chaos and dislocation was early days.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest.
By 1949, the big freeze settled on Europe. Irma Peterson in Gerald Fairley's hands-off bulldog Drummond, yes, Bleary Bulldog was staggering on in ghastly Labour Britain, lined up with the communists. Villain-wise, in the great game, they were now the only game in town. Ambler's arms traders turned out to have been good guys after all. Austerity dominated broke Britain. People ate beige, rationed food. A large slice of the empire, the Indian subcontinent, had been removed. It had been empire, defence of, which had sustained half a century of dreams around Lecoeur and Oppenheim, Buchan, Sapper and Yeats. Readers, particularly young ones and from the lower and labouring classes, could turn their attention from upper-class British fellows to the great Americans, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Dashiell Hammett, or dive down market to Mickey Spillane's Hammer, and in Britain to former Mosleyite Peter Cheney and his Lemmy Caution. The empire was washed up, even if some people weren't cottoning on, and the likes of Hannay were going the way of the East African groundnut scheme. Defenders of the imperial faith, even the old country, appeared to be anachronisms.
Mr. Fleming, where were you born?
I was born in London.
You went to Eton. I believe your main distinction there was in athletics.
Yes, it was. I'm afraid I wasn't terribly good at my books.
Victor Ludorum twice and public schools hurdles. And then Sandhurst?
Yes, I went to Sandhurst with the idea of going into the army and into the Black Watch, incidentally. But then it was decided to mechanize the army.
Fleming, Ian, born 1909, reading Buchan and Bulldog Drummond by 1920, calling his mother, M. Creator, from late January 1952, of Bond, James. The scent and sweat of a casino, wrote Fleming as an opening line for Casino Royale, the first and best of the series, are nauseating at 3 a.m. Bond was born, if we are to follow the chronology from Fleming's third thriller Moonraker, in 1918, but there is room for negotiation about that, if nothing else. He will not accompany Carruthers on a boating holiday in Friesland. Unlike Hannay, he will accumulate no family, no position in society. There is no gang of rugger-buggers loafing around him, as there is for Bulldog Drummond, just the wet Felix Leiter from the US of A, who still knew where the Imperial chips really fell. Bond is known for his number, not numbers. Bond, the existentialist, starts alone, and in hyperspace, after the end, he will be alone again, we know. He is 6 foot tall, has a scar on his right cheek and a comma of hair over his forehead. Fleming thought of Richard Burton, James Mason, James Stewart to play Bond, and Claudette Colbert as Diamonds Are Forever's Tiffany Case. He reckoned Bond looked like Hoagie Carmichael.
I joined Reuters, which was the nearest thing to the diplomatic in a way, because I could use my languages, German and French and Russian. And I had a wonderful time in Reuters, was a correspondent in Moscow and Berlin and all over the place. Mm-hmm. And of course I learnt there the sort of good straightforward, or at any rate straightforward writing style that everybody wants to have if they're going to write books.
How long did you stay with them?
I stayed with them for 3 years. But then I wanted to earn some more money, and Reuters weren't very keen on paying large sums in those days. I no doubt they're much better now. And so I went into the city. Mm-hmm. But I didn't get on very well there because I'm not very good at making money as such.
Reuters took Fleming to Stalin's Moscow. His own M, his mother, I suspect, led him to switch careers back into merchant banking.
Then the war came along and you joined the Royal Navy. You became personal assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence. Well, this led, not surprisingly, to some rather violent action, I believe.
Well, not so much that, really. It was a very interesting life. I took part in the Dieppe raid, which was a very bloody affair, and I had some exciting adventures around the world, and altogether I couldn't have had a more interesting war, if one can have an interesting war.
And presumably your naval intelligence experience provided some useful source material for your later books.
Yes, it taught one what one could say in writing thrillers and what one couldn't say, and of course it taught you really how the intelligence machine does work. I can't say that, of course, I tell that exactly in my books because they're fiction and the whole thing is much larger than life. But as I say, at least it tells you what mistakes not to make.
It was the war that took him to Bordeaux, 1940, where he watched those who could get away heading for the last boats out. They included King Zog and his entourage from Albania, Ambler's Ixania in The Dark Frontier, 1930s made reality. You could not make it up. You no longer needed to.
Then I went to the Sunday Times, to the Kemsley newspapers, and I became their foreign manager. They didn't have a foreign department in those days, and it was my job to place correspondents all around the world and look after their welfare and see that they wrote plenty of intelligent stuff.
Yes.
A perfect job for a writer, were Fleming writing, £5,000 and 2 months off a year at Goldeneye. Even if his friend Noel Coward thought it a perfectly ghastly house, Fleming had found his island paradise in a little bit of British Empire.
You write these books always at your vacation home in Jamaica?
Yes.
There's one a year?
There's one a year.
So the first one then, what, 1950?
52, written in 51, I suppose, yes.
Had you had this character growing in mind for a long time?
No, I can't say I had, really. He sort of developed when I was just on the edge of getting married, and I was frenzied at the prospect of this great step in my life after having been a bachelor for so long. And I really wanted to take my mind off the agony. And so I decided to sit down and write a book.
Once written, he showed it to his friend William Plummer. "I'm really thoroughly ashamed of it," he wrote to him. "The dialogue, a lot of the description, and the main characters are dreadfully banal, and 3/4 of the writing is informed by what I can only describe as vulgarity." Plummer disagreed, and passed it on to Jonathan Cape. But Fleming, unlike his alter ego, still lacked confidence. He told Somerset Maugham, another fan, that it was leaves from a cosh boy's own Janie.
Are you a systematic worker? Can you work so many hours a day regularly?
Yes, I find I have to. I work for about 3 hours in the morning and 1 hour in the evening, and I find unless I stick to a routine, if I just wait for genius to arrive from the skies, it just doesn't arrive. I just get on with the work.
Is Bond based on any particular person or combination of persons?
No, not really. He's a sort of a fictional mixture of commandos and Secret Service agents that I met during the war, but of course entirely fictionalized.
Yes, is there much of you in it?
I hope not. I mean, people do connect me with James Bond simply because I happen to like scrambled eggs and short-sleeved shirts and some of the things that James Bond does, but I certainly haven't got his guts nor his very lively appetites.
Yes, scrambled eggs did come up a lot, together with a spirits consumption that would have kept Bond drunk for most of his assignments, plus a 70-a-day cigarette habit. But it was, of course, the product placement that marked Bond out. Hannay would tuck into scones, Drummond bury his nose in beer, but Bond headed for the Taittinger 1943 Blanc de Blanc Brut, not a well-known brand as Bond, and I, of course, know, but probably the finest champagne in the world.
I get no kick from champagne. Mere alcohol, it doesn't move me at all. So tell me, why should it be true that I get a kick out of you?
Two people reacting to 1940s beige austerity inadvertently created, in the 1950s, the seedbed for the bistro and colour supplement world of the 1960s. A great writer, Elizabeth David, passed the war years in the Ambleresque world of the Levant, and came home and preached the gospel of Mediterranean food and culture. Fleming, who flitted in the war years from London to the United States, provided the fantasy. But rereading from the 21st century, it was a low-key austerity fantasy. An avocado here, a grilled kidney there, and another pint of Vouvray, please. And Fleming's reality at Goldeneye was something else. "When Bond drinks his wine, it has to be properly chambré," complained Noel Coward, "tornados underdone, and so forth. But whenever I ate with Ian at Goldeneye, the food was so abominable that I used to cross myself before I took a mouthful. I used to say to Ian, 'Ian, it tastes like armpits.' And all the time you were eating, there was old Ian smacking his lips for more." Meanwhile, back on the beach, the Kent coast in the 21st century to be precise, but no more than 20 miles down the road from the climax of the 39 Steps. This is where much of Moonraker was set, Ian Fleming's mid-50s story in which Bond fights Hugo Drax, who plans to fire an atomic rocket at London. Since Fleming wrote the book, I suspect, rather more Bovis homes have gone up. But what's interesting about the landscape is its kind of old-fashioned suburbia, homes for people who retired from London. And it isn't the kind of world you think of in the context of Fleming and Bond. But in fact, this is a lot of the time what Fleming wrote about, both in Moonraker and in Goldfinger. The thing that comes out of it is not the image of Bond, the dynamic international hero, but Bond, the hard-nosed guy in a traffic jam in Maidstone. If it is the stuff of movies, it's the stuff of British rank organisation black and white, not the widescreen stuff that actually followed. And the landscape shows that what Fleming lived in was the world of the Quatermass experiment. It was a world of cracking black and white televisions. That was his landscape, one out of the past of the 40s and 50s. The corporate fantasy that followed was something totally different, like the difference between 1920s Bentleys and Formula One in 2000.
And now the books are being made into films.
Yes, they've made Dr. No already, and it's been a tremendous success in England, and even more of a success, I think, in America, where it's opened several weeks ago, where it's breaking records. They're now doing From Russia with Love, and I went out to see them in Istanbul, see the unit at work, and I was tremendously impressed with the casting and the way the script had been written, and I think it's going to be an equal success.
They're going to do the whole James Bond canon.
They've got an option on doing all the books, yes, one after another.
In Moonraker, the women interest is provided by Gala Brand, the ice of whose reserve melted quickly in the Kent coast sunshine on a wonderful afternoon of blue and green and gold. Well, it's not quite like that today, actually. It's more brown and sludge and green and blue, and there's no real sign of Gala Brand anywhere. Mind you, she'd be in her 70s by now, I guess. To the left of Bond and Brand, the carpet of green turf, bright with small wildflowers, sloped gradually down onto the long pebble beaches of Walmer and Deal, Fleming wrote, which curved off towards Sandwich and the Bay. Beyond, the cliffs of Margate showed white through the distant haze that hid the North Foreland. It's all very much all this wonderful old England standing safe in a silver sea kind of stuff. But then things are about to change fairly drastically.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
President Kennedy at his inauguration. The new frontier changed many things. The inclusion of Fleming in the president's top 10 authors in 1961 changed everything for Bond. The last of the old imperialists was finally going global. The money really rolled in, and with it the isolation of Fleming from the project. Meanwhile, back home in Victoria Square, his wife, Lady Anne, was surrounded, he complained, by queers and effeminate intellectuals, sneering at his books. High Tory Anne, meanwhile, was having an affair with Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell. I envisage Fleming creeping past the drawing room, upstairs to his tiny study at the top of the house, getting back to Bond and another par about splendid, unself-conscious bodies. Oh dear. Fleming had stayed with the Sunday Times, and he had his first heart attack at the initial planning meeting for the Sunday Times colour magazine. He died shortly after his mother, M, in 1964.
Goldfinger, He's the man with the Midas touch, a spider's touch.
Ah, Shirley Bassey, Welsh proletarian and the true voice of the Bond movies, just as Sean Connery, Scottish proletarian, who was in the West End chorus of South Pacific when Casino Royale was published, was the image. As soon as Ursula Andress emerged, Venus de Milo-like from the Caribbean Sea, the imperial tide finally went out on the chaps who hung about the empire. Erskine Childers, English patriot, redefined himself as an ardent Irish Republican and was shot by Free Staters in 1922. Sapper died in 1937. But the new wave, Geoffrey Household and Eric Ambler, made it into the 1990s and a completely different empire-free world.
Goldfinger, pretty girl, beware of this heart of gold. This heart is cold.
Question, please. Where's the boat train?
Miss Florence Nightingale died.
What is the height of the Empire State? You, Richard Hannay? Listen, there's something you ought to know. Don't panic.
Yes, but look here. Those men in the films.
Look here, old man, you don't want to cause any trouble and spoil people's entertainment.
Where's the capital of... What are the 39 steps? Come on, answer up! What are the 39 steps?
From Bucham to Bond was written and presented by Nigel Fountain and produced in Manchester by Bob Dickinson.